Hello, good morning and welcome. It's Wednesday, March the 25th. The global head of Shell has warned that the ripple effects of the Iran crisis could hit Europe next month. Weeks of strict discipline by ministers avoiding talking about shortages now undermined. My name is Sam Coates of Sky News.
And I'm Anne McElroy from Politico. As disruption continues to the Straits of Hormuz, which handles a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas flows, the Shell CEO, Wael Salwan, told an oil and gas conference in Texas South Asia was first to feel the brunt, but it would move into Europe in April, and he added Shell was working with governments to help them address the energy crisis, including with storage and purchasing.
British ministers and UK business groups have been really consciously cautious about, and pretty much united in avoiding talk in public about the potential for fuel shortages. There's a psychological lesson that they're following, which is the fear that people with half full tanks, businesses with haulage with half full tanks rush to the pumps, and that itself, rather than disruption to supply, causes an interruption that suddenly becomes a bit unmanageable. There are certainly other bits of Europe that I've seen where there are queues at petrol stations, and they want to avoid that here. Even without a kind of interruption of supply. But the bottom line is that the Middle East conflict has already affected supplies of jet fuel, with diesel set to be next, followed by gasoline as the summer driving season gets underway in the Northern Hemisphere. At least that's the claim of the Shell CEO. But that doesn't mean that the fear doesn't exist of a problem coming, and the reality is that it could hit in a matter of weeks.
Other governments in Europe taking various approaches to this question. Germany's Economy Minister Katharina Reiche also warned that energy supply scarcity could occur as soon as late April or early May if the conflict continues at this pace. The context of that, Sam, she's a very punchy member of the Merz government, very pro-business, and she is pushing for the EU as a whole to loosen what she called a rigid adherence to climate neutrality and allow itself to miss the 2050 EU net zero target by about 10%. That's absolutely not the sort of argument that Ed Miliband wants to hear here. In fact, everything he's been saying in the last days has been about staving off that kind of argument, saying, told you so, this is because we're too reliant on fossil fuels. Germany moved close to officially implementing fuel rationing in 2022 for households after the Ukraine invasion. So it's a topic I would say more openly discussed there than it is here. France saying it's not going to consider a new price shield for consumers. It also had one back in 2022, but that does then raise the issue of what you're going to do if your kind of storage facilities are beginning to run low. And Slovenia has become the first EU member state to actually implement fuel rationing for private motorists. I'm struck that we walk very delicately around this topic in the UK.
It's true. I think actually inside government, they've been quite pleased with themselves about how the subject more or less has been avoided on the question of public disruption. Ed Miliband's Energy Department say that they're confident in the current levels of supply, and there's no evidence and sort of the resilience in this area, and there's no evidence of the interruption of supply now. But I have been talking to business groups, and I'm struck by their lack of ability to see a month ahead of what's going to hit. Partly just because nobody knows, because of the sort of instability. But there are other parts of government that are conscious that there is a more cautious approach taken by, for instance, some European countries who are actively telling their citizens not to go to the pump and fill up if you've got a half full tank, and how if British citizens put two and two together and realise that European leaders are saying something different to them, that could cause problems beyond their control. So it's not a sort of spotless picture. And the UK approach really only works if it doesn't end up being any disruption in the end. Otherwise, perhaps they end up looking a little bit silly. But the bottom line is that industry, government just doesn't really know, because it's unclear still, even this morning, how long everything's going to go on for in Iran.
And the path of the conflict is so hard to foresee. Conflicting signs, Iran claiming to have reopened the Strait of Hormuz to non-hostile ships after effectively shutting down the waterway. Brent crude is down to below $100 a barrel now. As we've all become pricing experts, at least we have on this podcast, after a very short training in my case. Meanwhile, Israel struck at Tehran early on Wednesday, according to media in both countries. And there's a Telegram post from the IDF saying that it has launched a wave of strikes targeting infrastructure across Tehran. President Trump is considering an invasion of Karg Island, the oil exporting hub on which the Iranian economy relies. And just to throw in, I was just with a big figure from Qatar yesterday, who does a lot of business in the UK, who was pointing out that for those countries where we have strong relationships and trading relationships like Qatar, they are really extremely worried because they rely both on access to the Iranian market and vice versa, but they also want to keep their defense and trade relationships going with the West, and particularly with Britain. So talking to sort of leading people who are in oil and gas, even in the Gulf, don't seem to know what they think is going to happen next, or where this is going.
Crikey, what a picture. A ground invasion by one turn of events, a 15-point peace plan by another turn of events, selective ships through the Straits of Hormuz, according to Iran. You can see why people don't really know how to plan. The truth is, Anne, I think we've had a couple of sort of jolts when it comes to fuel and supply in the last 2-3 decades. And actually Britain, I think, is thought to be relatively advanced in its planning if there are any problems. Ministers don't want to talk about this, but in their top drawers is something called the National Emergency Plan for Fuel. It was last updated just before the general election by the Tories in April 2024, and it just takes us through, and you can look at it on the gov.uk website. The government does have emergency powers under the Energy Act 1976 to control supply and demand of petrol products, really for the most very severe disruptions, but there's a lot of contingency planning below the surface that have got into that. So measures to ensure supply, like government access to reserve tanker fleet drivers and designated filling stations for emergency vehicles and critical services. So all of that is kind of just beyond what ministers will talk about publicly at the moment, but the work has been done. Now, Britain doesn't necessarily have the best track record, thinking of COVID, when it comes to implementing emergency plans. But I think this is something where there is a much better rehearsal than there was in 2020 with COVID. And so I think that plan, I think, from what I can tell in government, is thought to be relatively robust and well-founded. Should we ever get anywhere near that, and ministers would go out of their way to say there's no evidence that we do at the moment?
There are competing interests at play here. Look at the oil producers. According to Playbook this morning, Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been pushing Donald Trump to double down on the war with Iran, saying that this is a historic opportunity to reshape the Middle East. The New York Times reported that, and we followed it up. But maybe Keir Starmer might manage to talk him around. They did get on the phone last night. MBS used to be rather a reclusive character, is coming to the fore and doing quite a lot of conversations with other leaders in this crisis. And there is clearly a particular Saudi angle to that. So what was discussed, according to the record, is the need for de-escalation. Thank you, Downing Street, for that full and frank account of the exchange. We didn't get too much on that, but basically it's how do we get the Strait of Hormuz opened back up? What role can Britain play? Could we be, for instance, as has been mooted, a convener with France of a major conference about what to do on that score?
I would just love to listen into a call between Keir Starmer and Mohammed bin Salman. The dynamics would be wild. That's the dinner party I would want to attend. Okay, let's have a little turn to domestic events that you need to know. Before we do so, by the way, Anne, I'm delighted to say that Politics at Sam and Anne's, this little humble podcast, is the third most listened to podcast amongst MPs, which is kind of a cause for celebration, I think. It's very much our sort of one of our target markets. According to the consultancy 5654, this podcast is the third most listened to amongst MPs in terms of weekly listens, behind The Rest is Politics and The News Agents, which is lovely, lovely news. So hello to all you MPs. Please do get in touch with what you want to see more. If you want to feature in the podcast, tell us what you're up to, and tell your friends in Parliament and beyond about us if we can offer a service for them as well.
Exactly, and MPs, SPADs, everybody else, tell your friends, family, and any household pets that they should also tune in, and then, we could nibble away at the medal table. Who knows where we'll be next year? Prime Minister's questions today. The big announcement from government released 24 hours before PERDA begins is the big review into foreign interference in UK politics by the former top civil servant Philip Rycroft. To remind ourselves, that was commissioned by Steve Reed in December after Reform UK's former Welsh leader Nathan Gill was jailed for trousering bribes to speak in favour of Moscow. Playbook reporting that the expectation is there will be a call for an outright ban on cryptocurrency donations. This will ring alarm bells in Reform HQ because it is proudly declaring itself the first party in Britain to open its coffers to crypto. And Nigel Farage has complained that this is effectively directed at Reform. His argument is that, as he put in his speech last year, crypto, Bitcoin, digital assets are here to stay, and that he would launch a crypto revolution in the UK and would also accept Bitcoin donations. Coincidentally or otherwise, he also has a major crypto donor. But companies will have to provide information on the individuals behind corporate donations, whatever the form of the currency. We're also hearing that these urgent recommendations could become law within weeks. That means, obviously, in good time for the next election. Do you think it will solve a problem, Sam, or does it just make life difficult for pro-crypto reform?
I think this report will turn out to be a very big deal because anything that changes the rules of how we do elections in this country is a big deal. And that's what seems to be the point of this. There's a big lock-in this morning in the Communities Department for us to look at the report, which I'll be going to, and then I'll also be interviewing Steve Reed a little bit later today. The trail, I think, doesn't quite give you the big bit. What ministers are hoping for, as far as I can tell, is evidence that they can use to say, actually, there's US interference in British politics. And yeah, you heard that right. US interference in our democracy. This isn't just about Russia, although the Nathan Gill point is a trigger for it and a big part of it. But the sort of origins of this report comes from the period before Christmas, bit of a distant memory now, when there were rumors that Elon Musk might donate something in the order of $100 million to Reform. Now, Elon Musk is a foreign figure. Foreigners can't directly give into British politics, but you can do it through a company. But if you just directly get around UK rules by pumping money into a company, is that fair? Is it not? That's always been a grey area. That's the kind of key bit that's being targeted. Now, even though it's not true that original Elon Musk story was ever completely accurate, it totally shook ministers into thinking what safeguards might be needed. $100 million is just like a totally transformational amount of money in British politics. And actually, the truth is that there is the ability for foreigners to do that through companies. And I think it was just a wake-up call. So I think this is a big deal for that second thing, the transparency through companies and who's ultimately putting the money in, whether this is going to make the biggest difference. Whether or not it hurts Reform, well, they've got incredibly wealthy donors like Christopher Harborne on the books already and doing pretty well in the donation stakes. Actually, there's an even further right-wing party, the Rupert Lowe party, Restore Britain. Musk retweets Lowe and urges, including posts urging followers to join Restore Britain. So the Musk element of this, now actually he's directing his firepower elsewhere. But I think we could be on the cusp of pretty big change within weeks if this report, which after all is independent, does what ministers hoped it would.
That's absolutely fascinating that this ends up being as much directed as a tech titan from the US with pretty out there political views, Elon Musk and co, as it does Russia or China or others. The saga that keeps on giving at Westminster is, of course, the story of Morgan McSweeney's phone theft when he was Chief of Staff to the PM. Story via the Times, which has been pushing hard on all of this, is that police didn't investigate the theft of McSweeney's phone last October because officers were too busy. because of the focus of getting to the messages McSweeney might have exchanged with Peter Mandelson, but when in the run-up to him being appointed ambassador to the US, and that is an important angle. Now, the Met have released a statement effectively confirming McSweeney did report that his phone was stolen, but the force did then have to admit it did incorrectly recorded where the incident had taken place, and guess what, managed to just mix up two London streets in different parts of the capital. It does feel a bit more like cock up than conspiracy in that very British way, but hey, you can't deny it's a very bad look, isn't it, for number 10? It feels like the storyline in House of Cards, which opens with someone coming by on a balaclava on a bike and stealing a phone, and it all gets more into the drama from there. Two officials telling Playbook last night that it was indeed McSweeney's official phone, and that the then chief aide did follow protocol to report it. The question is, if the phone was wiped remotely for security reasons, where is that data and is it recoverable?
I'm no expert on data recovery, having lost plenty of messages down the years by accident. But this story, and I think, is all about timelines. And actually, the question of the police, the investigate, right, for me, that's all a sideshow. The point that what we learned yesterday from the excellent Steve Swinford scoop is that Morgan McSweeney's phone was stolen, we are told, in October 2025, right? So on Sunday, when the news of the stolen phone first emerged in the Sun on Sunday, we had another figure from the news today, Steve Reed, going on the media round that morning saying, no, all of this took place before the whole Mandelson situation even began. But Mandelson was sacked in September. The phone was stolen in October. And at the point, because I've gone back and checked, the front pages, Anne, were all about Epstein-related stories. A few days later, Kemi Badenoch went public with calls for document disclosure in relation to Epstein. So it just so happens that there was a political conversation around that time about Jeffrey Epstein, about documents, and about disclosure. And that was the moment that the phone was stolen. Now, we've got no evidence, no reason to doubt anybody's words. It's just one hell of a coincidence that if you look at, for instance, the Guardian homepage on that day, there are Epstein stories everywhere. It was at the top of everybody's mind. And that is interesting. So that's a fact. It's a question for Steve Reed, why he said this was all, the phone was stolen before the Mandelson situation even began, and we'll see how that all sort of follows through. So I think this one will run a bit, not because of the questions of police and whether or not they did their job properly and got two roads with the same name muddled up, but because of what was known at the time that the phone was stolen.
And also the question of, in that context, which, as you say, that seems to be more disclosure after the initial suggestion that there was nothing to see here because the phone was not in any way related to a timeline, which, as you're pointing out, it was sensitive about Peter Mandelson. Would it not have just been better at the time to have made public, that there had been, as there are for many people, a snatch phone theft on the streets and have it in the public domain? It's the way, sort of information, potentially negative information, sort of gets dragged out of this government sometimes and out of number 10. And I think sometimes perhaps does fuel more conspiracy theories than it stops.
Right, that is it. We're off for a busy day. Inflation actually has just come in unchanged at 3%. So that will be a little bit of relief. But I actually don't think number 10 Chancellor are going to be talking about inflation in a happy way for very much longer. Let's see how the Rycroft report, how PMQs and everything else feeds through today and how it all fares. I will see you tomorrow, Anne.
Have a great busy day and see you tomorrow.